Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special event from the Rhode Island Labor History Society. My name is Patrick Crowley, and I'll be presenting a piece of Rhode Island labor history that's not really well known, and I hope that will change after tonight. So first, let me say thank you to the Rhode Island Labor History Society for hosting this event. I really appreciate it. See a lot of members here, so that's a good thing. To give you a sense of where I'm going with this, I want to start off with some preliminary remarks. I'm going to briefly share some background about the work at Fields Point during World War II. We'll then talk about the experiences of the workers at the shipyard during the war, especially about the members of Local 308 of the Boilermakers Union and the struggles that they encountered, fought, and won. And finally, I'm going to end with some concluding remarks about what I think we can learn from the story. So to begin, I want to talk about a pet peeve I have about labor history. I think too much of it lionizes the CIO and either ignores or misrepresents the work of the AFL. And I think that that's a problem because, as most folks in this room know, they were two separate organizations for a long time. From the time the CIO formed in 1935 until it merged with the AFL in 1955, they operated differently. But I think for various reasons that we can get into in the question and answer part, I think labor history's focus on the CIO has produced some negative consequences, not just for the historiography or the history of our movement, but also for the work of organizers. And I hope that becomes part of the discussion a little bit later. One thing about that story that I think often gets missed is this part. Most people don't know it. I didn't know it. But during the years of World War II, broadly defined 1939 through 45, the AFL organized more workers across the United States than the CIO did. They had more individual elections. They had elections for bigger groups of workers. And really, the CIO was the junior partner during that phase of American history when it came to organizing people. And that's oftentimes when we think about the history of organizing in the mid-20th century to our peak of a movement back in the mid to late 50s, it's the CIO that gets a lot of the attention. The AFL does not. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think it's important to highlight that as part of this talk because it's an important feature. Now, I found that out from a key source that I'm going to use in my presentation tonight. There was a book that came out about 2006 by a writer named Andrew Kirsten, and he wrote a book called Labor's Homefront. And what Kirsten does in this book is make clear that across the country and across industries, during the war years, the AFL perfected a tool of organizing that was pretty innovative at the time. Now, we would probably refer to it as a project labor agreement. But for the time period, it was a radical new approach to organizing that the AFL was able to use to the benefit of the working class. It's also in Kirsten's book that I came across this story tonight about Boilermakers Local 308. It was only mentioned very briefly in the book, maybe a page and a quarter at most. And it was this story about what took place right around the corner from here that I know I had never heard about, and when I was talking with some other folks that are part of society, they hadn't really heard about it. Many folks had heard about Fields Point and the building of the ships in World War II, and many people had relatives or family or friends or older brothers and sisters that may have worked there. But there's a lot to be mined about what took place during 1942 to 1945, right around the corner from us, and this is only a small piece of it. Now, luckily, when I went looking for more information about this Boilermakers Local 308, I discovered at Providence College an entire archive that had loads of material about it, primary sources from the workers themselves and from people that were involved in the organizing there. And at URI, the same thing. The company produced a newspaper, a biweekly newspaper called the Yardarm. And some of the pictures that are on the screen here are from that paper. But that's housed at URI. And apart from a few mentions in some obscure scholarly articles and normally about other things, the story isn't told. So what I hope to do tonight is to share this amazing story because there's a lot of parts of it that I think are relevant today. Most importantly, it's out of these dusty archives is a story that is about understanding working class and cross-community solidarity, because fundamentally that's what this story is about. So let me tell you the story of Boilermakers Local 308 and the fight against Jim Crow unionism. The story is about how a young man named George Smoke and his co-workers, both black and white, got together to challenge one of the most racist structures in the American labor movement, the auxiliary union. I think George is someone that we should all come to know and count as one of our labor heroes. So, like I said, there's been very little written about this. What is written normally talks about how Thurgood Marshall, the future Supreme Court justice, rode into Providence one day, filed some motions in court, and tried to save the labor movement from its wicked ways. And while part of that is true, it really is a story about an interracial organizing drive at the shop floor level, led by workers of color. Now, I want to emphasize that point. It was led by workers of color in a campaign to fight against racial oppression while we were building ships to fight fascism across the world. The connections that these workers made in their own communities and at their workplace, I think there's hope and things that we can learn from. In the spring of 1942, the Navy set up shop in Fields Point on the Providence waterfront and hired a California company named Walsh Kaiser to build the ships that would be used in the Pacific Theater mostly. Thousands of workers were hired, including 3,000 women and about 500 African Americans. The women's part of this story has never really been told, and it's something that someone should probably really look into. Eventually, the shipyard would employ close to 20,000 people. Interestingly, the Providence Urban League was integral in the hiring process right from the start. James Williams, who was an organizer for the Providence Urban League, actually had an office in the shipyard hiring shack. And the whole idea was to make sure that he was responsible for helping to hire people of color into these relatively lucrative production jobs in the middle of the war. In the summer of 1942, there was a union election. The choice was between the AFL and the CIO. Now, I know that sounds a little odd. Why would it be not between the laborers and the Teamsters and the Boilermakers? It seems to be the case that there was some kind of agreement that the two main union organizations would be the only choices on the ballot. So you had a choice between the AFL and the CIO. The AFL won. And what took place next was the AFL Metal Trades Division negotiated a master agreement at the place, and then the affiliated unions began to sign people up individually. So it's an innovative tactic at the time. Now, the Boilermakers were the single largest union. They had close to 10,000 of the workers there. But the laborers were there, Teamsters Local 251 was there, the iron workers were there. Many of the unions that are still around today had a presence at this plant. In the winter of 1943, the contract is signed, and the unions start the process of organizing as local unions. It was reported by some contemporary sources that while there was some initial standoffishness, white and black workers got along together, and the black workers were welcomed into the local unions with open arms and treated just like any other member. This place at Fields Point seems to be one long chaos stream from the time it opened. And it wasn't just because of the frantic pace of building ships to go out and fight in the war. From the very start, things just didn't work right. The first contractor that they hired was a company called Rheem Manufacturing. Rheem had never built a ship before. And they still never built a ship because they never produced a single vessel that was seaworthy. So sometime in the late 1943, the Navy cancels their contract with ships still half built in the rafters and turns it over to Walsh Kaiser. Walsh Kaiser was a California company. Providence was their only East Coast port of operation. And they built what were called Liberty ships. They were frigates. They were tender ships. They would be the ones that would take troops back and forth to shore. They'd take supplies back and forth, deliver arms. And they were floating tin cans, more or less. And they were very dangerous to work on and very dangerous to build. There were also several wildcat strikes during the first year of the plan. This was despite the AFL taking a no-strike pledge. Now, the first wildcat strike that took place was because the Boilermakers were trying to claim jurisdiction over the ironworkers in 150 jobs. And the ironworkers took their members out for a couple of days to make sure that they wouldn't be absorbed into the larger Boilermakers union. There was a second strike in the summer of 1943 by the Boilermakers themselves. The first shift workers went on strike for 4 hours because they were upset that someone on the night shift, a man named Americo Petrini, won the election for local union president. And the story behind the story was that the guards let the night shift workers out 15 minutes early so they could go out and vote, and therefore the day shift workers felt as if their guy, got the short end of the stick, so they went out on strike. As you'll see from the rest of the story, Brother Petrini, the local president, would remain controversial throughout the entire process. But shortly after the first union contract was signed, Local 308 members started to notice that things were starting to change and not in a good way. Racial discrimination started to come into the workyard in a way that it hadn't before. Now, it's important to note that at the time, Providence was still very much a segregated city. For example, while formal discrimination and public accommodations had been outlawed about 50 years earlier, blacks could still only sit in the balconies at local theaters. There was at least one restaurant that was reported that whenever there was a black patron, the staff would break the dishes and the glasses so that they wouldn't be shared with white patrons that would come in later. And it was all too soon that this kind of discrimination found its way into the shipyard. Now, this is a good point for me to kind of break things out a little bit for a minute. What's an auxiliary union? An auxiliary union can be summed up very simply. Auxiliary members paid the same amount of dues, got half the benefits, and none of the rights. Now, at this time, the AFL, in a lot of different ways, was a racist organization. 15 different affiliates wouldn't allow African Americans to be members at all, and 9 others had this similar kind of auxiliary union scheme that was put in place. It was also at the time when, across the country, African American workers, led by A. Philip Randolph, were starting to agitate about making sure that wartime production facilities, didn't discriminate against people regardless of their skin color. So across the country, the NAACP and the various urban leagues were starting to call attention to this Jim Crow kind of unionism. One of the worst offenders of this practice with auxiliaries was the Boilermakers Union. One government official was quoted as describing the Boilermakers' discrimination as, quote, not only a source of embarrassment to fair-minded labor leaders and businessmen alike, but also a challenge to the authority and to the principles of democratic government. In their journal, which is one of the covers you can see in the screen, they actually ran a regular monthly column called Uncle Twiz Says, which was basically a minstrel character trying to give work advice to people in this really awful racist dialect. There's the cover of the journal there. In Newport News, Virginia, the Boilermakers made sure that the black workers were paid 50% of what the white workers were making. In Tampa, they called the Klan to visit black workers' houses after the workers had the temerity to protest some of the working conditions they were under. 300 African-American workers were fired from a Walsh-Kaiser yard in Portland, Oregon, and another 165 of them were fired from a Walsh-Kaiser yard in San Francisco. So with all of this in mind, the African-American organizers like James Williams set about trying to make sure that the same problems didn't surface in Providence because things had started off so well. Williams had first written a letter to the president of the Boilermakers Union in Kansas City asking him not to set up the auxiliary in Providence. He never got a response. He then went to the Federal U.S. Employment Service and asked them to intervene, but they said they couldn't do anything about it. And then he wrote a letter to Congressman John Fogarty asking him to intervene. And while Fogarty had given some initial impression of wanting to help and try to see what he could do, In the end, he didn't do anything either. So as a result, the workers figured out they had to figure out things on their own. Williams luckily met George Smoke. Now, George was already an activist. He served as the secretary for the NAACP-affiliated, quote, Colored American Club in his hometown of Fall River. And he was considered the lead man in his department. He was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1907, and he eventually made his way north, and he became a teacher at the Mount Vernon School in Lincoln, Rhode Island. But as World War II broke out, he ended up taking a job at the shipyard because it paid a lot more than what being a teacher would pay. So as Williams was organizing in Providence and running into roadblocks everywhere, George Smoke actually traveled to New York City on his own to meet with the Urban League officials there at their headquarters. And it was this confluence of people all starting to get involved in the issue at the same time. So the Providence Urban League was contacted by the national office, who put him in touch with George. And that's when things start to get interesting. So in the September of 1943, the Boilermakers business agent, a man named John McGuire, started to hand out new membership cards to all of the African American workers. When the workers had first signed up, they all signed a white card. Now all the black workers were given a pink card, designating them as part of the auxiliary. They were also told that even though they'd already been in the union, were already paying dues, that they would have to pay a $13 reinstatement fee for the glory of being able to join the auxiliary union that had no rights. After Williams and Smoke first met, they decided that they needed to confront the local union about this process to make sure that if there was going to be an auxiliary, what are the facts, because nothing was being shared with the members. So in September of 1943, George Smoke took to the floor of the union hall and demanded to be recognized. When he got to the microphone, he asked a series of questions. He wanted to know if it was true that an auxiliary union was being formed. If so, he demanded, who formed it? Where was it formed? Who voted for it? He wanted to know if it was true that the African American workers were going to have to pay this $13 initiation fee, and why it was so if they had already been members in good standing. Now, he didn't get any answers from the international representatives who were running the meeting. So another worker, a man named Jack Norton, he was a white member of Boilermakers Local 308. He took to the floor, and he put forward a motion before the body that the local union would admit any member regardless of skin color. Now, this is 1943 in an international union that part of its constitution was to make sure that there was segregation. And right here in Providence, the white workers started to join with the black workers to say, you know what, that's not the way we're going to do it here. Now, I point out that Norton is white for a couple of different reasons. The first is, in the historiography of this story, if Norton appears at all, they list him as a black man. Now, the archives make it clear, and some of the things that are on the screen show that, the Providence Urban League archives has a lot of notations about things that Norton either said or wrote, and every time they did it, they made sure to point out, white member. Right? But I think getting his identity correct helps transform this story, because it now becomes a story not just some disgruntled African American workers trying to fight a racist structure on their own and going to court to try to make a difference. Now it becomes a story of white and black workers struggling together and identifying with each other's struggle in a way that takes it from simply a battle of discrimination to one about cross-union, cross-culture solidarity. And this is something I think, as we talk about it some more, we can learn from. See, not only was the labor interracial solidarity unique to Providence, it was also an example of the black workers leading the way and the white workers following. That's not a story that often gets told in American labor history. And I think it's an important reason why, if we think about the powerful forces that are trying to divide the American working class today, it's something that we need to keep in mind about how we need to overcome the barriers that the powers that be try to put up in front of us. So the next step after the meeting that Smoke talked about was to see what the local leadership was willing to do about this issue. James Williams met with the local president, Americo Petrini, an Italian-American immigrant, and he was incredibly excited to find out that Petrini was also in support of the integrated local union. Williams pledged to fight with the black workers to fight alongside Petrini and against the auxiliary. And Williams also pledged to help Petrini get reelected in the upcoming December election by campaigning amongst the black workers for Petrini's reelection. It's not clear why there had to be another election in December, since there was just one in the summer. And there's nothing in the literature that explains why that might be the case. But I'm pretty sure that if a local election causes a wildcat strike, things were pretty unsettled, and maybe the idea was this December election was going to settle the idea of who's going to be leading the local union. As we'll see, it really did not settle matters at all. So while Williams was working with Petrini, George Smoke started to agitate on the shop floor with his co-workers. In November, he stood for nomination to the Boilermakers Convention that was supposed to take place in January of 1944, only to be told by the international representative, a man named William Buckley, who would go on to be the Secretary-Treasurer of the Boilermakers, that as a member of the auxiliary, he was forbidden to run for office and even to attend the convention. Undaunted, however, George wrote a letter to his fellow workers at the shipyard with the help of Williams and encouraged all of them to vote for the Petrini slate. And he had this great line in this letter that I think it just helps sum up exactly what the fight was that they were going for. So he wrote, "Our nation today is fighting for its very life. Whether the nation survives as a democracy in a land of opportunity for all people may be determined in some small measure by what we do in Providence next week." Now, Election Day arrived on December 14th, and the black workers voted throughout the day. But when it came time to count their votes, it was discovered that all of the ballots that black workers had submitted were marked with the letter C. They were put into a segregated envelope. And as the vote counted, the international rep Paul Hovey, he kicked all of the black members out of the union hall. The African-American workers at first refused to leave. With tensions running high, Williams conferred with the local president Petrini about what to do next. After being assured that the local union had enough support to protect the voting process, the African-American Boilermakers left the union hall and joined Williams outside. Williams wrote later that he was very concerned about civil disturbances erupting, but Petrini assured him that not only did they have the votes to win the election, they had the votes to make sure that the local stuck with Norton's motion to integrate. There were about 2,700 votes cast, not counting the 400 votes that were marked with the letter C from the African Americans. Petrini lost the vote by 120 votes. The men were devastated. While they were struggling about what to do next, local NAACP officials contacted Thurgood Marshall from the NAACP legal department, who agreed to come to Providence and meet with Petrini, local NAAC attorney Joseph LeCount, and the members that were involved. Statements were taken from 4 African-American members, including Smoke, and a request for an emergency restraining order was filed in Superior Court on December 16th. On December 17th, Superior Court Judge Charles Walsh granted a temporary restraining order, stopping the Boilermakers Union from destroying the contested ballots, and set a hearing date for the turn of the new year in January on the matter. Now, before they got to court, there was a special union meeting that was called on December 29th. Only the white workers were allowed in the meeting. But while they met, Jack Norton stood up again and made another motion to not only reintegrate the local union, but to make sure all of the ballots were counted. It was told that the motion passed unanimously to the sound of great applause. Now, it should be noted that Norton was also a candidate on the Petrini slate. He was running for recording secretary. So sure, he had an interest in making sure the votes were counted, but to think of a union hall in a contested election full of white workers unanimously voting to support integrating and counting their African-American brothers' ballots in 1943 is remarkable. So in mid-January the next year, the trial begins before Judge Alexander Churchill. And both white and black workers testified that the will of the members was to integrate and count all of the ballots. Another African-American worker named Carlton Blunt was asked if he was ever told why the letter C was put on his ballot. And I love this line from him because it's just perfect for a person named Blunt. He said, "No, but I had a pretty good idea." Now, when the Boilermakers International rep, William Buckley, took the stand, he testified under oath that he did not order the ballots to be marked with C, and that his only instructions were that members of the official union, not the auxiliary, could vote. When pressed on this point by Attorney Marshall, Buckley offered that if the candidates on the two competing slates agreed to count the C ballots, he would have agreed to do so. Pressed again by Marshall about whether or not that very motion was made by the two competing slates at the December 29th meeting, Buckley parried, and he told Marshall, "Well, I called the meeting to attempt to straighten out a muddled situation. No resolution was ever requested of me." Marshall pounced. "Wasn't a resolution put to you as a result of your statement that you had called the meeting, and didn't the local recommend that these ballots be counted?" Buckley answered meekly, "Yeah, that was their recommendation to me." Marshall pressed forward, asking Buckley if a member of the Providence Auxiliary didn't like the supervising officers from the white local, what could these workers do about it? Buckley answered that they could attend the Boilermakers Convention and make a protest. Marshall asked again, "But didn't you say yesterday that auxiliary members were not eligible to attend conventions?" Buckley's answer, and I don't know how he could say this with a straight face, "Yeah, that's right, but their friends could go." So, Judge Churchill ruled in favor of the black workers and voided the union election results. He also ruled that the auxiliary union was unconstitutional under the United States Constitution. The first time that action had been taken by a judge in the United States, right here in Providence. However, this was only a hearing on the injunction that the workers had filed. If they wanted to get this ruling by Judge Alexander to stick, they would have to go through a full trial, and that was scheduled for later on in the spring. Now, to support their efforts, and especially to raise money for the legal work, George Smoke and the other workers formed what they called the Allied Victory Committee, and they set about raising funds. Now, they needed to raise a lot of money. The transcripts alone from the day-long hearing would have cost $350. Now, laborers at the shipyard made 88 cents an hour. Skilled laborers made $1.25. $350 might have been $35,000 for people making that little money, and especially during wartime. But they set about and they raised the money. Smoke, there's actual record keeping within the Urban League's records that show that both white and black workers contributed to the cause to raise the funds. Smoke was incredibly articulate in how he communicated this issue to his co-workers. In one fundraising flyer, he wrote, "We have a profound belief in the future of organized labor, but that belief can only be sustained by the right to work and earn a living on an equal and impartial basis. Our contention is not against organized labor and its proclaimed principles. It is against a small and vanishing, but powerful and yet still existing element of labor which is fighting a desperate and losing battle to maintain an anti-American barrier between white and colored workers. They would prevent a real alliance of democratic elements of American labor if they could." With the funds finally raised, the workers proceeded to trial. The full trial produced a number of new and interesting elements that hadn't come out yet. For example, one worker, Gerald Hill, who was actually the named plaintiff in the suit, he told the court that even though his ballot was marked with the letter C, he was able to rub it off and stick it in the official ballot box before anyone noticed. One of the union stewards, a man named John Jeremiah, who was part of the election committee, he told the court that even though he and the other members of the election committee wanted to count all of the ballots, it was International Rep. Paul Huffey who told him, quote, "Johnny, these colored fellas can't vote in this election and they won't." In an interesting twist, however, one that has so far not been part of this story anywhere in the literature, is the fact that a clerk from Local 308, a woman named Pauline Leblanc, testified that it was she who put the letter C in all of the African American workers' ballots, under the instructions of International Rep. William Buckley, who had earlier testified that he had no idea how that took place. But she told the court that there were only 73 ballots with the letter C on them. So, even if all of the African American workers voted for Petrini, he still would have lost the election. Testimony would wrap up in a day or so, but the judge never issued a decision, because the last day of the trial was June 6, 1944, D-Day. So obviously there were more pressing matters in the country at that time, and especially at a shipyard who was building ships for this very invasion. Motions were filed, briefs were submitted, but the judge never finalized his order, because as this trial was winding down, a similar trial in California at the Walsh Kaiser shipyard in San Francisco had made its way to the California Supreme Court, and following Judge Alexander's decision, they also ruled auxiliary unions were unconstitutional. Courts across the state, across the country, started to do the same thing. By 1948, the Boilermakers Union and the AFL unions that had similar structures had all made auxiliary unions a thing of the past. Now, it's important to note that even as Local 308 started to fade away, the shipyard itself was closed in 1946. Production stopped mid-1945, and for the next year, they started to wind down operations. But George Smoke continued his activism. He was invited, and it's not really clear how he got the invitation, but he was invited to participate in October of 1944 at a symposium at Howard University on the subject of, quote, the post-war industrial outlook for Negroes. Now, I think it's great that this took place in October of 1944 with the war still going on a year later, and they're already talking about what things look like for particular communities after the war ends. Now, George was on the panel with the executive vice president of the Boilermakers Union International, a man named William Calvin. And Calvin gave some platitudes about how, the war will be over soon and we need to, start to think about working together with people. George went right at him, and he said, listen, any serious look into the coming post-war era poses some very provocative questions for the colored American ship worker. The chief questions concern the continuance of the tacit agreements between management and certain elements of organized labor by writ or ritual discrimination against colored mechanics and unskilled ship workers. While such practices are not general through the structure of organized labor, they are nevertheless used and in many cases condoned by management. Now, as I said, Local 308, as the shipyard disappears, Local 308 disappears. But this seemingly quiet end to Jim Crow unionism in Providence seems to raise a lot more questions than answers. For one, the thing that jumps out at me is, what was the actual status of the contested ballots? Why did George Smoke and his allies think that there were 400 ballots, but only 73 ended up showing up? It's perfectly logical that some of those ballots just were disappeared. Maybe they were stolen, maybe they were lost, maybe they were misplaced, but something seems fishy there. But then you remember that Thurgood Marshall was the attorney here. And it doesn't seem likely to me that someone with his stature would leave that kind of issue to go unchallenged. But it appears to be the case that when they found out that there were only 73 ballots, no one, including Thurgood Marshall, challenged that representation. But it's also equally plausible that there were only 73 ballots that were marked with the letter C. Remember, this local had 10,000 members. Only 2,700 showed up to vote. That's about 30%. Now, it's conceivable that every African-American worker did show up and vote. But is it really likely, especially given the tension over this very particular issue at the workplace? I mean, even if they did a Herculean get out the vote effort and got 50% or 60% of their members to come out and vote, it's still a lot less than the 400 that they thought that they had in hand. And it's an unanswered question of why that is. But still, another question is, why did Petrini lose this election? Why was it even so close? If every time they had a union meeting, the membership voted unanimously to support an integrated local, sometimes to applause, when people actually had the chance to vote for the slate of officers who were in favor of that, they didn't vote for that slate. Now, only things that we can do is really speculate about what that is. I mean, maybe it was hard feelings over the way Petrini won the election in the first time. Maybe it was some kind of Bradley effect, where the white workers were telling their co-workers that they would support Petrini, but when they got into the ballot box, they actually reverted right back to, racial prejudices that they were all born with. But we really don't know. But unlike the other places in this country, Portland and where local union officials were decidedly against integration, and Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, where the local unions encouraged a race strike when the company tried to hire 3 African-American workers. This local went out of its way to make sure that their black comrades were welcomed into the fold. Why they voted against that particular slate then remains a mystery. In 2006, some of the members of the society have seen this. The Boilermakers published this beautiful testimonial book about the history of the Boilermakers Union. It's got color pictures and stories of organizing drives and all of the ships that they built during World War II. Local 308 appears nowhere in it. It has completely disappeared. I called up the Boilermakers Union, and they actually have a full-time archivist who works in their headquarters. They have no records of Local 308 at all. Nothing. Now, what he did tell me is that it was chaos in World War II. Local unions were formed, grew to tremendous heights, and disappeared all within 3 or 4 years. So it's not surprising that there weren't any records. But with the history of this case and all of the paperwork that was going back and forth, it's surprising and it's disappointing that there aren't that many records left. As I wrap this up, I think there's some conclusions that I try to draw from this, and I'd be curious to know what other people think. The first is this. Despite the hype, the working class, both white, black, brown, or whatever, when given a chance, they will work together to fight as equals for the things that workers across this country have known that they need. Decent working conditions, a safe environment, decent pay, and the ability to not be bothered and harassed at the workplace. The second thing that I take away from this is this, that sometimes big history is really made by little people. People that will never get the credit, that won't appear in the history books, but who nonetheless make a huge difference. And one of the reasons why I'm honored to be able to give this talk with you tonight is because without us in this room knowing about the story and sharing it, even if it's in this small little world of Rhode Island Labor History Society folks, that means that the memory of men like George Smoke, Gerald Hill, Carlton Blunt, and others won't disappear and fade off. Because what they did here in Providence in a lot of ways, changed the American labor movement for the better. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.